They called it Operation Northwoods. Kept secret for decades, the document was obtained by journalist James Bamford and published in his book on the National Security Agency, Body of Secrets. The author explains, in 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff drew up and approved what may be the most corrupt plan ever created by the U.S. government. In the name of anti-communism, they proposed launching a secret and bloody war of terrorism against their own country in order to trick the American public into supporting an ill-conceived war they intended to launch against Cuba. Among the suggestions, a fake hijacking involving remote-controlled planes to be blamed on Cuba, the blowing up of an American ship, also to be blamed on Cuba, and a terror campaign in Florida carried out by anti-Castro exiles, to be blamed on Cuba. The most remarkable fact about Northwoods itself was that it was approved by every single member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officers in the land. Only when it reached the desks of Defense Secretary Robert McNamara and President Kennedy was the plan nixed.
The idea was to create a pretext to show that there was an attack by Cuba on the United States, and the idea was to have U.S. personnel from the CIA and other places secretly create terrorism in the United States. The documents actually said people would be shot on American streets, bombs would be blown up. And again, all this, the evidence would be laid to point the finger at Castro.
Northwoods was a proposal for what is termed in intelligence jargon a false flag operation. For students of war, there are multiple overlapping strategies for the defeat of the enemy. The first tactic is well understood: physical violence between opposing armies. The second, far more mysterious, is cywar. In psychological operations, the target is the mind. Not just enemy personnel or infrastructure, but the beliefs, motives, and ultimately behaviors of entire societies. Alexander the Great is credited with one of the earliest recorded examples of the military psyop. When he was forced to retreat from conquered lands, vacuums of power were left in his wake. To discourage pursuers, he advised his craftsmen to build and leave behind massive body armor, such as would befit giants, breastplates and helmets for mythical men 8 feet tall. The discovery of the objects would make his enemies think twice before giving chase. The 11th century warlord Genghis Khan used similar tactics of creative deception. Prior to military campaigns, agents of influence disguised as villagers from an already conquered region would be dispatched into enemy territory to warn the people of the horrors awaiting them. To further intimidate opponents, Khan devised a trick of light. As darkness fell over his encampments, he ordered his men to light 5 campfires, where only one was necessary. Observing the spectacle, one scout reported back that Khan's army had more fires than there are stars in the sky. In the modern age, cywar would evolve into an art form. President Eisenhower defined psychological warfare as anything from the singing of a beautiful anthem up to the most extraordinary kind of physical sabotage.
Black propaganda, well, let's start with the white propaganda. White propaganda is propaganda, persuasion, news, media operations of one sort or another that are openly acknowledged by their sponsor, which in this particular case is the US government. So the Voice of America, for example, is white propaganda. Black propaganda, on the other hand, is disavowed by the agency that's sponsoring it. It operates on the basis of plausible deniability, so that if something goes sour or the true goals, the true nature of the propaganda is revealed, then the actual sponsor can say, no, we didn't do that. We didn't have anything to do with that. The accusations that we had something to do with it are just completely wrong. They're a fantasy, and so on. So black propaganda involves both media operations on the one hand, persuasion, publicity, but typically it will be media that poses as opposed to the sponsor in order to discredit the side that's being attacked. Let me give you an example of how that works. Suppose you're in the middle of the Cold War. There's a radio battle, and this is actually a rather benign form, comparatively, of black propaganda. There's a radio battle between East and West, and one side or the other creates a radio station that poses as being the other side's voice, and then says outlandish, stupid, provably false, or very hostile things about the first side. Okay? Well, then the first side can use that as its own propaganda by saying, see, this is the people that we're dealing with. They're completely nuts, or they're completely corrupt, or they have no integrity, or a whole range of other types of accusations.
The false flag operation takes the concept of black propaganda to a murderous extreme. Secret agents carry out an act of terrorism or other outrage, which is then blamed on the enemy of choice. Oftentimes, false flags are perpetrated by what Lawrence Klein of the U.S. Army War College called a pseudo-team, individuals who are organized to impersonate enemy forces. Citing examples from the Hue insurrection in the Philippines, the Mau Mau in Kenya, the French in Indochina, and other conflicts, Klein stresses their utility in intelligence gathering. But there are other, more important uses. In 1951, the democratically elected leader of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, was overthrown by the CIA and replaced by the fascist Shah. The man in charge of organizing the coup, Kermit Roosevelt, explicitly referred in his memoirs to the use of false flag operations. In the year 2000, New York Times reporter James Risen obtained a previously secret account of the coup written by CIA agent Donald Wilbur. Risen explains, in early August, the CIA, seeking to stir up anti-communist sentiment in the religious community, stepped up the pressure. Iranian operatives pretending to be communists threatened Muslim leaders with savage punishment if they opposed Mossadegh. In addition, the house of at least one prominent cleric was bombed by CIA agents posing as communists. The fact that Mossadegh was not a communist to begin with was of little concern to the plotters. The real threat was an independent Iran in control of its own oil reserves. Coinciding with the false flags, mobs were paid by the CIA to riot in the streets. In his book, CIA Diary, CIA whistleblower Philip Agee indicates that the tactics used during the coup in Iran became a matter of routine. In some cases, a timely bombing by a station agent, followed by mass demonstrations, and finally, by intervention by military leaders in the name of the restoration of order and national unity, is a useful course. During the brutal occupation of Algeria by France, an even more elaborate pseudo-team was created. In the mid-1950s, the Direction de la Surveillance du Territoire formed a group known as the Organization of the French Algerian Resistance, or ORAF. Posing as members of the anti-colonial resistance, ORAF committed false flag bombings, targeting civilians with the aim of quashing any hopes of political compromise. Sometimes, false flag operations fail. Under Operation Susanna, in 1954, Israeli military intelligence attempted to carry out a series of false flag bombings in Egypt. The targets were to be American and British businesses, and were to be blamed on the Muslim Brotherhood. According to Israeli historian Shabtai Tevet, the assignment was to undermine Western confidence in the existing Egyptian regime by generating public insecurity and actions to bring about arrests, demonstrations, and acts of revenge, while totally concealing the Israeli factor. The operation was cut short before the bloodshed could begin. Conspirator Philip Nathanson was caught attempting to detonate a bomb in a British-owned theater. Israeli Defense Minister Pinchas Levin resigned over the affair. Some false flags meet with initial success, only to create blowback at a later date. During the attempted coup in Venezuela, anti-Chavez forces intentionally fired on their own supporters, killing several people. The goal was to create the illusion of a popular uprising and government crackdown. The coup plotters, along with Bush administration spokesman Ari Fleischer, appeared on television denouncing the alleged government attacks and offering support for the coup government.
We know that the action encouraged by the Chavez government provoked this crisis. The Chavez government suppressed peaceful demonstrations, fired on unarmed, peaceful protesters, resulting in 10 killed and 100 wounded.
Venezolanos, el presidente de la República ha traicionado la confianza de su pueblo. Está masacrando a personas inocentes con francotiradores. Para este momento van 6 muertos y decenas de heridos en Caracas. Esto no lo podemos permitir.